I'm delighted to moderate this session, which is one of the most exciting sessions for me anyway, which is to, after we've listened to the esteemed presenters deliver a set of wonderful presentations and big thoughts, to bring it back to the libraries, to ask, what does this mean to us? What does this mean as a community? What does this mean to the work that we do individually at our own libraries? And what can we do at a system level? How do we cooperate in solving the challenges or opportunities that we've listened to over the course of these 2 days? So we've pulled together a panel of 3 librarians from the membership of the center to share some of their thinking about what they've heard here, what was brought out in the SSRC report, just to kind of bring some issues out from the library perspective that we will take up in conversation over the course of, I believe, about 90 minutes or an hour with this panel before we wrap up for the day. So let me introduce them all up front, and each one will be giving just a brief set of remarks or thoughts, the things that they want to take up continued conversations on. First, to my immediate left is Elizabeth Foster, who's the Social Sciences Data Librarian at the University of Chicago, CRL member. Elizabeth serves as the Social Sciences Data Librarian, but she's also the subject liaison for sociology. She supports research and teaching in these fields by promoting public use data and the library's data collections. Elizabeth also offers consultations in support of research projects and research data management. She provides library instruction as well to classes and support to faculty who are developing data-driven assignments. To her left and in the middle of the table is Darby Orcutt, who is the Assistant Head for Collections and Research Strategy at North Carolina State University. Darby supports interdisciplinary research collaborations, including many with strong engagement and citizen science aspects. Much of his research and teaching focuses on communication and culture of science and how these intersect with the various publics. And finally, at the far end of the table is Matthew Sheehy, who's the University Librarian at Brandeis University, CRL member. Matthew is the University Librarian who oversees the operations, including research and instruction, access and technical services, and archives and special collections. Prior to joining Brandeis, he held leadership positions in access services at the Harvard University Libraries and reference and research services at the New York Public Library. He's served on the program steering committee for the Hathi Trust. He co-led the Boston Library Consortium's heads of resource management and helped launch the Manhattan Research Library Initiative, Marley. I believe we're going to start with Elizabeth, who's just going to offer some preliminary comments, and then we'll move down the table in turn.
Hello. So I have some thoughts today about public-private partnerships and where that leaves libraries. So Facebook in the past has denied being a publisher, preferring to categorize itself as a platform. But by supplying data to researchers, it's now clearly a publisher. The users are the content providers. They're also the product that they are supplying. In libraries, there's been a lot of traction recently towards walking away from publishers with unfavorable and outrageous terms. And I'm wondering what happens when we look at Facebook with that same level of scrutiny. So just a brief set of things. Facebook was recently fined $5 billion by the FTC for mishandling user data. Its targeted advertising practices have violated the Fair Housing Act and allowed housing complexes to discriminate against certain groups they consider to be undesirable. They also engage in a wide-ranging set of surveillance activities that are impossible to opt out of. If you do not have an account on Facebook, they can still track your day-to-day activity on the internet. If you deactivate, they still track you. It's really impossible to escape their reach. In other words, I don't think Facebook should be treated like a normal data publisher because they're kind of an extraordinary situation, unlike any sort of corporation we've ever seen before. Their reach is tremendous. And I'm concerned that the more we have engaging with these data sets from these corporations, we're forgetting the fact that they have a tremendous impact on our society and how they're shaping the world that we live in. So I'm posing a question: if there's an ethical imperative for libraries to invest our resources in collecting data and developing a middle way that promotes our priorities of privacy and access. It's kind of hard to say what that looks like because I am not a developer. I work primarily with students, faculty, and staff who want to use data. But building a middle way would allow us to develop things that meet our ethical and professional standards and also prioritize open, shareable, and reusable information. So DocNow is an interesting alternative. They are developing user-friendly tools for collecting and preserving social media content. And there's a strong commitment to prioritizing ethics and user intent in content creation. They have a Slack channel where they communicate with users who are interested in contributing the data to the project. And perhaps these types of projects are a suitable path around public-private partnerships and allow researchers to get access to imported social media data. So we have a limited amount of resources, time, energy, money, and I see there's a lot of opportunities here for libraries to enter this space and begin developing these sorts of tools. I think also there is a imperative for libraries as educators to communicate with the public about the important research that is being done with social media and kind of making the public more comfortable with this direction and understanding that there is a need for people to access this information to improve societal outcomes. I think the average user doesn't really understand privacy or how certain things work and may view certain things as an intrusion or a violation of what they consider to be their private community space. However, if libraries take a lead in communicating out these research outcomes in a way that the general public can understand, we can help boost the value of your research in reducing public discomfort with this sort of information. So there's a lot of room here for user education, patron education, and developing a new path towards making sure that we are handling data and resharing it in an ethical fashion that really is in line with our professional values. I'm not opposed to Facebook sharing research data. I think it has value, but I also think that we have to remember that Facebook is a massive corporation with corporate objectives and shareholders, and none of these groups necessarily answer to library priorities.
First of all, I want to say thank you to all the wonderful speakers over the last couple of days. I've completely rewritten my remarks with regard to what you've said, and so I just want to share some of the ideas that have been flowing through my head as I've been listening. From the very wonderful keynote that started us out with Dr. Alondra Nelson, it struck me that the problems that we're having with social research now, writ largely, are really good problems to have. That they may speak to the very success of social research. I think of traditionally in the 20th century and into the 21st, we've seen really the power of the sciences, particularly the natural and to some extent the biological sciences, and in really creating the narrative of our world. And now I think we see social research rising to prominence. So many of the problems that we're seeing are simply because of the growing scale and the growing regard for social research. So we should be excited about that. I think, though, that what's happening, though, is a little bit different. Whereas at the time that now social research is really gaining more and more prominence, and it's kind of funny. I mean, you think about it, the natural and the biological sciences have been so much a part of the narrative and so effective in policy and as forces because they've been long recognized for their strength in predicting and affecting the physical world. And so it's both wonderful and scary to think of the social sciences as now being seen as important in predicting and affecting our social world. So it is a bit of a dual-edged sword there. But I do think about an interdisciplinary context, and I think of just the involvement of social research now, much more so in the sciences. If you look at the ways that some of the funders are funding the sciences, Department of Defense, NSF, NIH, they're being much more inclusive of social researchers and really recognizing that there are social issues that need to be involved alongside the scientific research. So it's happening a little bit differently for social research, but I think again it speaks to the success of the social sciences fields. I do think that for libraries, as we're looking at the ways that our roles are changing, I think that it raises a couple of very uncomfortable questions for us. One, I think, both for us and for the research community, is really thinking about these questions of what is good enough? In libraries, we've always thought of ourselves as presenting, very strong, curated, reliable information. And I was very grateful for Michelle Alexopoulos talking about, well, hey, I see there's noise in everything that I'm looking at. And that is important. I think that Dr. Levenstein also talked about intentional noise being looked at in the census. And of course, if you've ever worked with geospatial data like Google Earth, there's intentional noise in Google Earth where things are not exactly modeled in the way that they are in the real world, in part to prevent folks from using that as tactical information for missile strikes and things like that. And so it's really important, I think, to really think about this modeling of the world that we're doing, and to think about it, very intentionally as a modeling. And what does that mean? What's good enough will depend on our purpose. What's good enough will depend on the scale that we're really looking at. I do also, I think that, really libraries being a part of thinking through the ethical dimensions of these things is going to be really important. One of the things that this report talks about, and I think is really significant, is how far behind our IRB system is, how far behind we are in thinking about what are the right ways to go about this type of social research. I know of instances where we have lost data scientists from academia to the private sector simply because they could do the types of research, they could ask the sorts of questions that were relevant to their interest, but they couldn't do that within the antiquated IRB system of a university. For example, these questions that Bryce raised of, traffic cameras and looking at facial recognition software, and what's public, what's private, what's different because it's being done at scale. In terms of library roles, I think that the biggest thing that we need to be focused on, and we've needed to be focused on it for years, is basic access to this data, basic access to our collections as data. That is something that and really being able to provide that at scale. So it's not it's not individual researchers having to go it alone and having to go through these very pragmatic and individual steps over and over again. How can we, both as libraries and as a library community, really play a role in making sure that we're not just providing access to human readers, but we are providing access to computationally assisted readers. Certainly the questions, the things that you saw coming up from the researchers, and these mirror what I'm asked by researchers that I work with, or they see the libraries as natural sites for metadata support and help. They look to the libraries for storage. These are not necessarily services, especially the storage that many of us are set up to sort of provide, but how do we be a part of that conversation? How do we be a part of figuring out what and how we keep things? Libraries should be very good at that. However, I find that particularly when it comes to this area, maybe we're not. I think when it comes to supporting data content, I've said before, I feel like research libraries are oftentimes solving today's problems tomorrow. Which is kind of ironic because libraries have always been supposedly about looking ahead. But we have been behind in these areas, and I'm so glad that we've had this conversation over the last couple of days. One of many. I think CRL's been a real leader in trying to get the community to think ahead. But as we look at the future, not just what are the things that our researchers need now, but what will they need? Where do we need to put our scarce resources, our scarce efforts into really doing the best that we can as a library community? I think that a lot of the issues of metadata quality are probably not ones that that I think personally we should be taking on. I want to pose the question of, with the rise in artificial intelligence, with what even some of our speakers today talked about in terms of using machine learning to create metadata, we may be at this moment where investing in really creating strong metadata may be the equivalent of hiring a bunch of scribes to copy manuscripts when we're really at the dawn of the printing press. Maybe we need to focus our efforts in other areas. I was very grateful to see that we were talking a lot about new formats, and we're looking at audio, we're looking at video. These are the areas where we have to be paying attention. If you're just thinking about text mining, data mining, that was a while ago. That's what the research community needed 10 years ago. Not what it needs today, and certainly not what it needs tomorrow. So I do think that we can be thinking more about this, and thinking more about this again in these kind of larger terms of how do we work to sort of standardize those protocols to access to data? How do we work, like Dr. Levenstein talked about, this idea of a researcher passport? How do we create a library passport that says, hey, our institution can provide the sorts of security and the sorts of mediated access that is necessary, to make a proprietary owner of data to feel comfortable that we're going to treat that data ethically and responsibly. So these are some of the questions that I've been pondering and we can talk about. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm going to give a library director's perspective. The terror in my face is not being in front of you fine people, but it's hearing the conversation that's going around the room. and trying to understand how libraries are going to continue to be supportive of our faculty and the good work that's being done. So if you'll indulge me just a moment, I want to talk a little bit about Brandeis and why I feel it's really important that we have this conversation. So Brandeis is founded on a social justice mission that is really growing the demand that we do cultural research, especially in the social sciences, and we do it in an empirical way, and we try to remove a lot of the bias. So the work that I've been listening to over the past few days is really the kind of work that we've begun to do. We see social science research as a vital and physical place for innovation and interdepartmental work. So our social science faculty have actually thought about putting a building up to do this kind of work because they feel it's so important to our culture on our university. The challenge is we're a medium-sized R1 university and have a strong identity in the liberal arts with our undergraduate program. So we kind of have to be all things to all people, and that's not always something that we can sustain. We're definitely feeling some growing pains, and our president feels it's time for us to leave the startup culture and become a more mature university. But because of our strong faculty, all the things we do are really worthwhile doing. So how do we choose what we're not going to do anymore? And this is the place where Brandeis is currently. A big part of this conversation and being here is that social science is one of our strengths. So I want to thank CRL and Bernie and everyone on the team for pulling this meeting together, because this meeting is where we are in our university. And maybe your profiles are similar, and maybe you're in bigger universities that don't have the challenges we do, and maybe some of you are much smaller ones that have different challenges. But I think that what I'm articulating is probably felt by a lot of the medium-sized research library directors that are out there. So my thoughts about this are really around the infrastructure and training. And both of these things have been touched on by many of the presenters, but I want to give a little bit different perspective, or at least my perspective on it. So faculty know what they need and what they want, but they don't always know how to get it. So we have developed silos and pockets of technology across our university, and even the EAB recently called it out as an institutional risk. The IT piece is very much an institutional risk. And I know we're not alone, because the EAB is looking at that. So what we're doing on campus allows for creativity, but it's really risky to the integrity of our overall university network. It's unsustainable, unscalable, and as the success of these scholarship projects grow, and they are growing, we have some amazing work being done in Brandeis. I was so proud to have one of our projects, but that's only one, and we're doing many projects at Brandeis. This research is all starting to make incredibly large data sets that we have to begin to think about what to do with. And what's happening now, as I'm sure is happening on a lot of campuses, it's being stored on hard drives under desks. We talk about it, we joke about it, but it's really happening, and we see it. Maybe thumb drives in drawers, but with the size of these data sets, I think a lot of it's hard drives under desks. So really, the library has to step in and do some of this work with IT to ensure compliance and preservation, along with other offices across the campus. So it really has to be a collaborative effort, but a lot of the work is falling on IT and the library, at least on our campus. Having been a merged organization in the past and having only split about 3 years ago, it's a challenge on Brandeis for trying to figure out what our roles are. So where does academic technology fall? Actually, within our library, emerging technology falls within the library. So we do a lot of the digital scholarship work. We do a lot of the drone flying. We have fabrication labs. We have artificial intelligence labs. So all of that falls within the library's area. The IT supports the underlying system. So we're trying to still figure out how to do that to support all the faculty and the work that's being done. And I'm sure, again, we're not alone. There's a big discussion about where this work should fall, and there's different models across many universities as to where academic technology does fall. I do believe, and I've heard this a couple of times, that there needs to be a community, and being very lucky and being in the Boston community, we have a lot of opportunities to partner. But what was funny when I was hearing about this is I was thinking a lot about the shared print conversations that we've had not long ago, and the fact that will there be haves and have-nots? Will there be free riders if we start to develop community-based repositories? And all of those conversations that we've talked about with shared print, we're having again. And I think we're going to have to continue to have. So I thought that was kind of interesting from my perspective, hearing that conversation. The other thing that I thought about was, where does this cost for the data come from? So within Brandeis, we've stopped thinking about an acquisitions budget, but rather a scholarly resource budget. And as we begin to talk about the data sets that not only we purchase, but that we create, and to talk about hiring students, and to talk about hiring assistants to help build these data sets, we're making scholarly resources. So we have to figure out where that money's going to come from. So does that come from our scholarly resources budget? So if you take an extrapolation from what I just said, does moving into social science big data research mean journal cancellations? So we can have that fund to do that work. And this is something that I'm thinking about, like, where else am I going to get the money? The other challenges we have is librarian training. Now, our librarians are amazing at Brandeis. They're some of the sharpest people that I know, and I'm really proud to work with them. But there are growing expectations. They're not only training the students, but they're training the faculty as well. They're training the faculty on programming languages. We put out a call for just an R summer event to see if anyone was interested, and with a day and a half, we had 60 people registered and had to restructure how we're going to do this. We teach them data visualization. We teach them GIS, and not only how to do geospatial information systems, but also we teach them how to fly the drones to collect it. So we've got some faculty that we're training how to collect these huge data sets with the drones that the library purchases and uses and loans out. There's also a need for training and acquisition. So as we heard over the course of the day, or the past 2 days, that there's a lot of different clauses in purchasing data that we have to start to think about. And libraries get pushed into some agreements by faculty where we would want to push back. I would want to push back. I'll take ownership of that. But the faculty really need it. So we end up signing agreements where there's pre-approval for articles, and there's NDAs, and there's things that I would want at least to have a conversation about. But there's so much pressure sometimes that we just have, deans will come down and be like, we need this signed. And I'm like, well, can we have a debate about this clause? And they're like, no, we need this signed. So there's a lot of pressure, and so our acquisitions people have a lot of training to do as well, because they need to be able to know the issues and be able to speak very articulately about it. When a dean comes to their office to try to go around me, they've got to be able to have that conversation. So for me, there's a real cost in keeping up the professional development. So it's not just getting the resources, it's making sure that the people that work in the building that I'm responsible for have the training and the skills and the opportunities to grow in the areas that we need to grow to support this, like, 2 days of amazing work. I can't believe what's going on. So it's really fantastic. So the last piece that I have is that, well, the last piece, and I'll tell you now because it's always best to know, is it's not doom and gloom. So the penultimate piece, the piece before that, is that while we're doing all of this, nothing has really changed. So our undergraduates still need to know how to do a citation correctly. They still need to know how to do information literacy and look within a database to find the articles that are relevant to their topics. They still need to have a space where they can speak to a librarian and have a conversation about their family, because at the end of the semester, certainly in our building, we have a lot of tears and a lot of tissues with the pressure these poor students are feeling nowadays. So nothing's really changed as far as the traditional thing. And when we say, well, what are we going to give up to do this new thing? I haven't found it yet. So hopefully as part of this conversation, some of you out there can help me in the next 45 minutes or half hour or however long we have left to tell me what I can give up in my library so that I can continue to support this amazing work that's going on. And that's not a shaming statement. That's a literal statement. I'd really love to know the things that are sort of drifting away. So the last thing that I'll say is one of the things we do need is faculty advocacy as much as possible. On our campus, we have a supportive provost, which is great. She is really enthusiastic about the library, but every time that I bring up an idea or talk about the amount of increase we would need to our scholarly resources budget, she looks at me quite frankly and she says, well, where do I take it from? Do I take it from faculty salaries? Do I take it from the groundskeepers? Do I take it from, where do I take this money from? And she said, if you give me an idea and we have that conversation, we'll do it. So I've been very lucky, and we're one of the few units on campus that isn't held flat because the deans believe so much in what we're doing and how we're supporting their faculty and their general education requirements and digital literacy. But that's not a sustainable model. We have to find others. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation and hearing your thoughts so that I have a lot of ammunition, besides amazing slides that will eventually be posted.
No, absolutely.
But besides the amazing slides that will eventually be posted, there's lots of ammunition I can go back to campus and continue to support the social sciences big data research that's being done at Brandeis. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you all. Wonderful, wonderful statements, and there's a lot to unpack in here, I think. One of the things that I heard, I think, coming out of Darby's comments, the idea of pulling this community together. My sense is, I mean, from listening to these presentations, from reading the background documentation that the SSRC had put out and the background reading to this, we are very much in an area where there's intense competition in this sphere. Every other day I read something about a university that's opening up a new social data center or a school of informatics or something where they're looking to do some groundbreaking work and to get out ahead of the field in front of their other partners. And that seems, of course, that's the nature of universities in many ways, but it seems to me that that's running counter toward the sense of libraries that we should be working more closely together on these common challenges. I was very heartened by the presentations today where, cooperatives of libraries were pulling together with nonprofit organizations and others to create shared tools and facilitate work across campuses. But I don't know from any or all of your perspectives if you're seeing commonality across institutions in the work you're doing here and ways that we can further promote that and foster that. And I'm sorry, we only have one mic on the table, so we got to do a little pass back and forth. But anybody who wants to speak out loud, I would welcome that.
Can you jump in on that?
I guess I will. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, and I think it's difficult for a lot of the reasons that my colleague here has articulated. Is that what do libraries give up, or what do they what becomes less of a priority? So I think that's where people are stuck. But I think that at the same time, I think that what a lot of research libraries have given up, as we've all been trying to do more with less, has been to give up that further horizon perspective on how we're going to support both our campuses and scholarship more largely. And so that's why conversations like this are very important. I think CRL has been one of the few library organizations that's really been trying to keep the eye on the further horizon. But it's not enough to just say, hey, we'll pay our dues to CRL and outsource the future of these things. I think we do need to all come together. And so, but yeah, I think that what has been your best? What have been some of the things that you've given up?
Wow. Well, I had a Harley in graduate school that I gave up, but I have a beautiful daughter for it, so that's okay. So what I would say is, so at Brandeis we've taken a three-prong approach to collection, and I think that can be mirrored within the data world. So the three-prong approach within collections is that, of course, we support what's needed for research. So we purchase what is being taught and what material needs to be used for teaching. So that would be the data sets that, the government data sets and the things that we do that are used for classes. What is it, what is that, Mark? What it is? Social Warrior, whatever that Oxford product is. I can't remember. Anyway, so that's important to have. The other thing that we do is we really think about our unique collection. So the data that we're collecting, we have a really wonderful Western Jihad project going on campus by one of our faculty members, and that's super unique, and that we're going to keep, much like we were going to keep our first folios and a lot of our other rare collections within Brandeis University. The third piece of our collection is joining places like the CRL, like Hadi Trust, like the Eastern Academics Scholars Trust, and being part of collectives. And I do think that, if I understand the question right, really being part of these collectives, whether it's finding places within societies where we can share data, whether it's within Boston looking towards something like the Boston Library Consortium and convincing them to put together something. I know Harvard, MIT have done a wonderful job of putting together a shared repository. So I really do think that part of the future of research libraries is some sort of collaborative, and I think it very much mirrors the paper world for me, at least.
I will say one of the things that that I gave up, and I'm thankful to my colleagues and the leadership at NC State for supporting me in this, is many years ago, gave up the idea of purchasing any archival collections, digital archival collections that didn't come with data access. And that was a big deal at the time, because when I first made that decision, nobody was offering that as one of their terms. They're now that's become something of a norm in a large part of the industry. So I think making those kinds of decisions, and then letting your vendors decide which of them you're giving up is another approach as well on the collections end.
I think one thing that we've struggled with at UChicago is demand for prepackaged, easy-to-use solutions for people who have limited experience scraping and tapping into data. They want to do this kind of work. They don't have the requisite experience, and we aren't necessarily able to provide an out-of-the-box Twitter corpora or whatever it is that people are asking for. So what we're trying to do instead is develop internal expertise and spaces in our new Center for Digital Scholarship, where we can hopefully train people so they can engage in these research activities.
It brings me to another theme that I sort of picked up on, and apologies to our previous presenters. This is not meant in any way as a criticism, but it seems to me that the faculty are out there coming up with brilliant ideas and identifying the sources that they want to use, and then going out to pursue those, and maybe only secondarily or not at all have considered the library's position in being a partner in that negotiations. I was wondering, I mean, Elizabeth, you're working directly with faculty and students all day long, and Darby, I know you work a lot, in this area. What is your experience or approach and recommendations to getting out to those faculties early on in that process, if you have any?
Well, one thing that we are trying to do now is partner with research centers on campus, where it's the first place faculty go when they get their grants and start their projects. So UChicago has the Social Science Research Center, which is the one I'm affiliated with, and we're trying to get in on the ground and do a lot of professional development and training there for those graduate students and faculty to let them know of the resources that we have, that we can help them review license agreements and negotiate more favorable terms, making sure that they don't forget that we're here.
I would say in an ideal world, I'd want to have a library collection that did not discriminate against robot readers. So in other words, anything that you found online in the library, you could access the data and use it in that way. But we don't live in that ideal world, do we? But one of the things that we don't do, and I mean, I think we really have to think hard about, is how do we promote the discovery of the data sets that we do have access to, that we do provide that access. We don't do that. None of us do that well that I'm aware of. If you're doing that well, please let me know. But how would a researcher know what are the corpora that they can work with in that way? Yes, the library has access to it. Yes, I can read it as a human. But what can I actually mine? What can I actually work with computationally? We've got to do a better job on that discovery end.
So some of the things that we've done is we've worked really hard with our students. So the creative spaces, the audiovisual lab, and the studios and the maker labs and all of those that we have in the library. It sounds like our library is big, but it's really not that big. The rooms are really small. But anyway, the students that get engaged and are interested in this kind of work, they come to us and they'll tell us. Well, very often we learn from the students at what the faculty are thinking about, and that's really helpful. We have a very strong liaison program, so our liaisons go out and talk to the faculty. And then what's really been good for us is that we've started a new general education requirement process where one of the core competencies is digital literacy. And what that's done, it's forced is a strong word. It's surfaced a lot of the really interesting work that faculty are doing because they're trying to use that to meet that digital literacy competency. So it's really just sort of really lucky that these two events came together at the same time. And so we're beginning to hear classes begin to circle around some of these really interesting projects. They call in librarians to be part of that. We learn about it, and we're making more connections. There's a lot more connections to make, but those are some of the areas that we're trying to focus on.
I think that speaks to some of the concerns we heard earlier about, training the students to go out in the world and handle data. I'm sure they'll miss the resources of the library itself, but hopefully have been, engaged in that training and the ethics, as you're suggesting, in ways that they can use that. But I suppose there are no guarantees for that. I was wondering how we treat those ethics, or how do we imbue those ethics in the students who go out into the workforce. I'm not sure anybody has an answer to that, but certainly the digital literacy part is an important component, as is the sort of the IRB process, which you say is antiquated. Are there suggestions for pushing that along? Anybody else in the room is free to answer these as well, by the way. Let's get you the microphone.
I don't have much to say about pushing the IRB process, but
Let's wait for the microphone because people online can't hear you. Sorry.
I want to mention quickly just something that one of my colleagues at the University of Iowa started doing within political science that speaks a lot to data literacy. And so essentially, freshmen, we have to offer these really large freshman courses, which are kind of electives about data literacy, loosely described at Iowa as one of the initiatives on campus. And so the course that he offers is essentially a course on American politics, but also kind of the evolution of the use of data. And so the key component of the course is that within the class, like, students do data analysis in the sense that they look at, he teaches it mostly in Stata. And so they look at Stata code, and basically all they're required to do is hit enter. And then the assignments are like, on line 4, adjust this by 1 unit and hit enter. And so the assignments are not really designed to make it so people are experts in data analysis, but he's found that just a lot of students who are interested in social sciences get over this fear of interacting with data at a much earlier state in their undergraduate training. And so because of that, it makes it much more proficient by the time they actually get to classes where they're starting to work with data analysis. And our department has been very supportive of this general idea, and I think we're going to start more aggressively incorporating it into future curriculum, especially for first and second year students within political science, trying to get them exposed earlier. And so, yeah, Fred Bemke has done a lot of work on this class, and it's really, really interesting. So, thanks.
I think one of the things that we can do as libraries is to have these conversations about what does privacy mean in the 21st century. We have ourselves in libraries perhaps some very old-fashioned ideas about privacy that may not apply today, or maybe may apply differently. And we really need to think about that. I mean, we need to think about that from the standpoint of privacy and digital literacy of our students. we need to think about that from a user experience perspective. What are I hear a lot from students about user experiences that they are used to having with commercial websites, for example, that they cannot have with the library website because we are so careful not to keep their data, not to, you know, and oftentimes we are really only hiding their personal data from ourselves because it's still there somewhere in central IT or what have you. So we really, I think we really need to be having that conversation in libraries as well. I think we also need to think about the fact that, you know, particularly when it comes to the IRB process, you know, there are a lot of things going on that we may see as real issues. You know, for example, you know, thinking about, you know, public cameras and facial recognition and tracking the movements of people. Well, if research in that area is too, you know, is so onerous that our IRB process, like, people's heads explode when they think about that, then that sort of research is not going to happen in the university. It's going to happen in the private sector. Do we want to not have a seat at the table for thinking about how that research is conducted and how that research could be conducted ethically?
Am I allowed to jump in?
Please, yes.
Okay. So I think in terms of the whole conversation here, and I heard questions sort of, first of all, I hope it's not absolute terror on your face at Brandeis. But I think as an outsider, as a researcher looking into the way that sort of the libraries have sort of historically been created into silos and everything like that, I do think that there is a big role for breaking the mold to some degree in terms of trying to figure out where your investments are most efficient. Some of this goes with the privacy issue that you were saying, and I have noticed this in terms of talking even to librarians in my own system about the issue of privacy. We buy a lot of things, doesn't mean all of it's going to be used. That information that's being collected on who's using what over what time period actually may be very important in trying to find efficiencies in the system as to what will free up various monies. I guess lucky for me too, apparently I just got an email from the provost at Toronto saying she wants to have a conversation with me when I arrive back in Toronto, so I'm hoping to tell her she needs to invest more in some of these things at U of T libraries. But when you think about the university as a whole, and your provost says to you, well, where do I get the money? When we talk about data literacy and we talk about training for the students, some of these non-traditional resources really can be used in computer science, in economics, in sociology, in history. That, I mean, if the bread and butter is sort of the undergraduate education sort of attracting people, it's not even necessarily that we're competing with one another as opposed to, as the economist saying, look, there's a huge demand for these skills. There's reasons why these are basically popping up everywhere, and it's not that it's going to be a zero-sum game. So that when we actually want to cooperate on certain things, this is actually more efficient. And in terms of the haves and have-nots, a cost-sharing model, I think, is probably even better in that situation. You also mentioned some very unique data sets that were done inside your university, and I'm assuming that contracts for a lot of the American universities are the same kinds of provisions as ones that I have. That there are intellectual property rights that are in there for the university and for the researchers, that if this does have commercial value outside, you can even have two-tier pricing and recover some of the funds by thinking about certain tools that were created. I'm not saying go out and charge exorbitant rents, but certainly in terms of redistributing money back to the library, to the systems that helped create some of these things, to the researchers and the research teams, by reinventing the way we think about how those resources get shared, and not say everything has to be open access all the time. I know that that seems to be something that's very much ingrained in a lot of the librarians that I talk to, and I keep saying that's not, as you said, a sustainable model for the future, especially if we have a finite amount of cash that we have to actually figure out how to best allocate. Even in terms of your thumb drives. this is why I was saying last year, I said, all right, I'm going to spend $30,000 on a new server. Is it going to stick under my desk? Most of the time, I'm not using every single piece of the capacity of the computer power that I use. If we integrated it into the library system, which is this time I did, right? When I'm down and don't need all of that power, it could be used for somebody else. So if we have these sort of different ideas about how we're going to set these things up, I think that might find you some of the money that you say, where do I get this? It's not that I say kill off all the journals, because that's not going to work, obviously, or take away resources, but finding creative ways to harness extra sources of resources that we hadn't had before traditionally embedded in the library system. I think that might be a good way of sort of pushing forward.
I want to open it up to the floor for comments, questions of the panelists, questions of each other, things that you would want to see further raised in the conversation today.
I'm a little bit wary of even raising this because I can see the direction where things are going. Because of faculty needs, because of the pressure of the research, the library may be abandoning its ethics around privacy or something around those. I appreciated Elizabeth's comments thinking about what our ethical imperative is around data. It's very, very tricky for us because we see our role as giving researchers what they want. But we're a library, not a vendor. And, you know, finding that middle way. So I just wanted to say I really appreciated those comments or observations. And also just to bring up an anecdote, recently a colleague and I looked at something called L2 voter mapping.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We didn't have any pressure to buy it. Thank goodness. Because it was amazing, the data that was there. Triangulated from all sorts of different sources, including all the cookies that are on your computer. So what they know about an individual voter, the kinds of things Cambridge Analytica, I guess, was doing. And, you know, do our researchers want it? Thank God none of them asked for it. This is also really expensive. But this is a challenge for me. I mean, there's all of the challenges. There's where are we going to keep the data we're buying? What do we do about providers that say we have to give the data back? What's the library's role in giving the data back? I don't know, releasing it somehow. And then this whole ethical challenge. So it's huge, but I just am concerned if the direction is we have to ease up on our concerns about privacy.
And just to be clear, I'm not necessarily advocating for that. I'm advocating for that conversation, though, because again and again, I hear from our users that they would be very happy to do as we all do on these devices, which is to agree to give up some of our privacy in exchange for certain benefits. So it's a conversation that I think we need to be having.
Michael first. Thanks.
Sort of along those lines, and maybe this is a comment for a different venue, but we haven't really talked about another source of information, and that's information, our users' information, and that we, I don't know that we've done a great job of being able to use that in order to improve our own services, and now there's sort of an imminent risk of us giving that away or giving up sort of oversight of that to vendors through the RA21 standard. So I'm just wondering what people maybe think about that.
Yeah. Good. Prepare your responses. Michelle had her hand up as well, though. Yeah.
Okay, so one thing I just wanted to be clear about as a researcher, I wasn't advocating that the university violates ethics on this. What I was indicating was more of a comment specifically about user data. If the users have opted in to wanting to use certain systems and better their own experience, that is part of the terms of use of what it is that they've done. I believe it would be ethical if they understand what you're not trying to connect it and report back that, I'm reading, literature that might be questionable from somebody's point of view, or monitoring on that dimension. But if you're talking about use stage of who, I guess it could be a number. It could be A, B, C, D, and not attached to a person per se. How often are you using certain types of materials inside the library and everything like that? There's certain levels of privacy protection and stuff that it's not violating ethics, I think, in terms of mining some of the stuff that you naturally are going to see, that is naturally going to be collected by Google Analytics, which is being used by a lot of our universities, and by the libraries when they're trying to protect things from denial of service attacks and everything like that, to see where this information is actually, how often it's being used, who's looking for things at what time. It's just what we mean by who, I think, has to be a discussion to be had as to how much information gets added back in. But I still think it's worth having that discussion, because I think it's going to help you in the long run.
I didn't mean to sound like we're completely naive, and I didn't mean to sound like I'm completely terrified. That wasn't my goal. So we actually do use a lot of data analytics, and we anonymize a lot. We look at our resources very carefully, and because of our data warehouse, we can tell by department where we're allocating resources and where we're not. So we are very much looking at user-generated data to help inform the decisions that we're making. We're using it to help us decide what resources to purchase and which ones not to. We're using it even in terms of what parts of the building are used the most and where we could put a new lab because it's not as used. I think most of the libraries out here are probably doing similar kinds of work. And I didn't mean to sound as naive about not having any resources at all. Much like many universities, much like your own, we have a program where we do develop patents and we do develop products and we do look at how to redistribute that. And the data sets have not been, to my knowledge, monetized, so that's a great idea. It is a really great idea, but there are other things. For instance, we have a traditional press, and it's not open access. We charge, and we do strive for not revenue plus, but we strive to at least break even with it. So we explore those things, but I think hearing from faculty about the other things that we're not thinking about and knowing that there'd be support is really helpful. So I thank you for that, because I think that's something that I can bring back.
Yeah, I was interested in Elizabeth's cautionary remark about Facebook and about dealing with the organizations where the values are at odds with our library values, and your comment about the toxic products that might be scooping up data from God knows where. I wonder if as libraries, having the values of maintaining the values of privacy and open access to information, do we sometimes find ourselves at odds with our parent institutions, whose interests are very often to gather more and more granular personal data to keep students safe and for other purposes, and who also competing with the corporate sector for research funds and research money, and therefore might be consider some of the issues of privacy and those kinds of things that might disadvantage academics, researchers in the competition with their corporate counterparts.
I do think that that's a definite risk, but at the same time, I think it's important for universities to understand that there are certain user protections and things that we need to do for our audiences to make sure that we are using their information responsibly. with all of the data leaks and things that you've seen, like Equifax, every day information can get out on the web and harm people very easily. And I think it's important I do think sometimes if you do want access to certain things outside of the academy, you may need to seek corporate partnerships or work elsewhere, because there are limitations and there are marginalized populations that are at risk for harm.
Any final thoughts? Any final questions? Bernie has many final thoughts, I'm sure.
You're gonna sum up?
Yeah.
Okay, so, yeah, so I won't encroach on that. But I do think that there's the opportunity and need here for a conversation between libraries and the parent institutions on just these issues, on the issues of access to data. I think one of the comments was made that, you know, we know what to do, but we don't know where the money's going to come from to do it. I think the case needs to be made to the universities that they need to invest way more heavily than they are in this kind of, in issues of access to data, acquisition of data, rights to use data, and that investment should go through their libraries, that the libraries are the right place to frame these conversations. They're the ones that have the experience in dealing with commercial providers and the commercial sources of data, be they Elsevier or others, and that what we've seen in ARL libraries has been a steady reduction in the investment in libraries for the past 20 years at least, and we're now seeing the effects of that. So, but I always love the volunteers, CRL, to start to frame narratives and conversations, and I can do that now because I'm stepping away as president of CRL, so.
All right, very good. Thank you all three for sharing your thoughts, which I think were illuminating and cause for much further conversations to be had. Yeah, appreciate it. If you want to go back.